Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to go on a journey to the coldest, darkest, and most mysterious parts of the solar system that we still know very little about. Locations far, far away from the sun, where even today astronomers discover new objects pretty much every single year. But to be more exact, we're going to be discussing some of the new updates about the search for mysterious Planet 9, the object that scientists have been trying to find for the past 10 years. A massive object lurking on the outskirts of the solar system that, just like the Schrödinger's cat, might exist or might not. And so in this video, let's discuss some of these recent studies on the hypothetical Planet 9 and what we know so far, and talk about these recently discovered objects that seem to almost definitively suggest that it either does not exist or does not exist anymore. Mostly because these recent discoveries of strange distant objects is now forcing us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the outer solar system. But to understand why this is important and how this idea of Planet 9 even started, we first have to discuss a slightly different object referred to as Sedna. The object whose image you see right here, taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. And while technically this is the minor planet number 90,377, and was originally discovered in 2003 by Michael Brown, Chad Trujillo, and David Rabinowitz. And it is, based on its size and its mass, a dwarf planet. Essentially an object that's somewhat similar to Pluto, although it's a little bit smaller, with a diameter of 1,000 kilometers, but possibly resembling Pluto in a lot of other ways, especially in color. It seems to be one of the reddest objects in the solar system, maybe resembling something like this. And that's because its surface, apart from water ice, contains a lot of methane and nitrogen ices that seem to be covered in compounds referred to as tholins. These usually form when you expose some kind of an object to UV radiation from the sun for billions and billions of years. But the thing is, Sedna is also a dwarf planet that should not be where it currently is. And that's because pretty much most objects that we know of in the solar system are usually influenced by gravity of something. For example, for many of these dwarf planets, such as Pluto, they're influenced by the gravity of Neptune, which usually forms some kind of a resonance with these objects, or forces their orbits to assume a certain pattern. And though initially Sedna was classified as a member of the scatter disk, it has now been reclassified as a prototype of a group of objects literally referred to as sednoids. Essentially bodies that are way too distant to be influenced by Neptune, and that's basically detached from everything else, with its overall orbit resembling something like this. Its closest approach to the Sun is 76 astronomical units, which is approximately twice as far as Neptune is from the Sun. But at its farthest, it's at a staggering 937 astronomical units away, which basically makes its orbit one of the most extreme, but not the most extreme as you can see from this image. And while because of its bizarre orbit and because it's not influenced by Neptune, the natural first explanation was that something else must have pulled on it in order to create such an eccentric orbit, because otherwise it just does not really make a lot of sense. With this essentially being one of the first clues for the potential existence of some other mysterious planet somewhere out there. But for a very long time, we've only known of a few such objects, such as 2012 VP113, funnily enough nicknamed Biden, and 2015 TG387, whose motion you can actually see in this image, and that's now also known as Lilea Kuhonua, one of those super difficult to pronounce Hawaiian names. And so because of these initial discoveries, and because of these somewhat bizarre orbits, in 2016, Caltech astronomers proposed that the orbits of these extreme trans-Neptunian objects might be best explained with a relatively massive planet hiding on the outskirts. Especially because at first their orbits seemed to be kind of clustered, as in they were all tilted in a very similar way and made their closest approach to the Sun in a relatively similar location, with the initial mathematical model suggesting that the odds of this happening by chance only being like 0.007%. And well, they essentially suggested that a planet of approximately 5 to maybe 10 masses of planet Earth was basically shepherding these objects into these very unusual orbits. That's the nutshell of the Planet 9 hypothesis. But despite approximately 10 years of hunting for this object, instead of finding it, researchers actually started to discover something that seems to now challenge this hypothesis, because additional objects have now been discovered that not only do not fit this pattern, but even sort of contradict the hypothesis. And you can actually learn about individual discoveries in some of the previous videos in the description, but in a nutshell, one of the first such objects, and the most significant ones, was 2017 OF201, a dwarf planet candidate approximately 700 kilometers across, with an incredibly wide orbit taking approximately 24,000 years to complete. Way longer and way larger than Sedna. And though at first, based on this picture, it might seem like it also fits the pattern, there is a bit of a problem. The orbit of this object is a major outlier. It basically does not align with any other extreme trans-Neptunian object, and especially the ones that are known as sednoids used to predict Planet 9's existence. In fact, when scientists ran computer simulations trying to figure out what would happen to this object if Planet 9 was real, they discovered that if this planet existed on the outskirts, especially at distances where scientists think it might exist, it would actually eject this object from the solar system within just a few 100 million years. In other words, unless this was some kind of a new arrival, its existence in the solar system should not be possible. And since it is there, the current predictions for Planet 9's location do not make sense. But finding one such outlier or one such object could possibly be explained in some other way. But then, last year in 2025, researchers discovered another one. 2023 KQ14, now referred to as Ammonite. And once again, yet another dwarf planet that seems to have a somewhat bizarre orbit. And this one is also important because it fills a kind of a perihelion gap. Or basically a gap where we thought no object should be possible and no dwarf planet should exist. In other words, we assumed that all of these sednoids would basically have very similar perihelia, the closest approach to the Sun. But just like the previously discussed object, Ammonite's orbit is also pointed in the opposite direction to all of the other sednoids in the original cluster. In other words, if Planet 9 is there, this object should also not be possible. And though technically we've talked about this discovery not so long ago, following a rigorous peer review, this study has now been officially published in Nature Astronomy, essentially 2 days ago from when I'm making this video. In other words, this discovery seems to be official and seems to create a major problem for the Planet 9 hypothesis. With the question now being, okay, so is Planet 9 there or not? Or basically, can it still exist somewhere out there, or do we have to start looking for other explanations for these bizarre anomalies? Well, first of all, this paper and the previous study essentially suggest that the current location of Planet 9 cannot be possible. In other words, if Planet 9 still exists somewhere out there, it has to be much farther away in order to avoid destabilizing objects like Ammonite and 2007 OF201. But if it is really far away from the Sun, it might not be actually influential enough to create sednoids, and might not even be there anymore because technically any nearby star passage that very likely happened many times in the last 4.5 billion years would have actually kicked out this planet from the solar system because of gravitational disturbances. And so here we actually have some additional explanations that no longer require the existence of this mysterious planet. In other words, we have some very interesting explanations that do explain the orbits without the need for extra planets. And the first one is basically what I just described, a Planet 9 that used to be there but just got kicked out. This is the ejected architect hypothesis. And so here we have a planet that possibly existed in the early solar system and did influence these orbits, but was ejected billions of years ago and is now just a typical rogue planet wandering the galaxy. And by itself this does make sense because even modern calculations and simulations of the solar system suggest that there were at least 2 extra planets that very likely existed somewhere in the inner solar system before being kicked out. But trying to prove this or finding evidence would be extremely difficult, which takes us to the next part, or the next explanation: passing stars, or basically star flybys. And you can learn about this topic and some of the more recent star flybys that were even witnessed by ancient humans in one of the videos in the description. But in essence, an object like, for example, the Scholz star, or many different other stars that used to exist close to the Sun when it was still much younger, could have passed close enough to the solar system to pull Sedna and a lot of other members into their unusually stretched orbits. In other words, a lot of this could have been the result of star passages and not necessarily Planet 9. Then we have another explanation that actually makes a lot more sense because it is something that we know exists even right now: galactic tides. Or basically the galaxy itself, and specifically the central region, actually constantly tugs on all of the objects in the solar system, and that of course includes planet Earth, and over billions and billions of years can stretch different orbits into different shapes, slowly changing them in a lot of different ways. And so in this case, it could be the galaxy itself that created these orbits and caused certain objects to potentially even escape the solar system over time. Although in this case, the tides can also come from something within the solar system, the massive disk that the solar system still contains, or basically the overall mass of the solar system formed by various small objects such as different comets and different asteroids could provide enough collective gravity to, over time, stretch orbits of smaller objects into something we see right here. And so here this will be gravitational effects from various objects in the Kuiper belt and objects in the Oort cloud, with basically the collective gravity causing some of the more distant objects to assume some of the most extreme orbits. But having said that, none of these answers still explain everything and still definitively tell us why many of these objects have these orbits and what exactly is happening. In other words, even today, as of mid-2026, there is no good explanation. And though obviously finding some kind of a hidden planet and some kind of a lost sibling world would be super exciting, right now it's these alternative explanations that seem to make just a little bit more sense. But the good news is that we might have some answers very soon, and that's because of new telescopes like the Vera Rubin Observatory that's expected to discover a lot of these very difficult to see objects and is going to conduct a lot of powerful surveys discovering many different objects we've never seen before. Which, by the way, it has already done many times, but in this case it mostly discovered asteroids and not the mysterious Planet 9 yet. And though in some of the previous videos we've discussed potential discoveries of something that resembled the Planet 9, right now, once again as of 2026, none of those objects have been confirmed yet, and none of them seem to be a definitive discovery. And so for now, the outer solar system still remains mysterious, and these sednoids and their outliers still do not have a good explanation. But as more discoveries are made and as more data comes in, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos once it becomes a little bit more clear what's actually happening. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying a Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.